There was one of those shows on A&E or the History Channel or something. It was called Mega Building, maybe, or Impossible Engineering. That's one that's running right now. Or maybe it was PBS Nova. But it was like, oh, I think it was almost 20 years ago that I saw this show about floating cities. And I remembered the description of how this would work. And at that time, this is about 2 decades ago, at that time, this was not just on the drawing board, it was already in the works. I have no idea what stage it would be in now because I've heard nothing more about it. But there were independent squares that were, of course, joined very securely together, but they were independent so that if a big wave came up, the whole structure wouldn't rock up like that. It would have to create a little ripple that would work its way through these little. It's kind of like the design, as I understand it, for buildings that are earthquake proof. And you could just join as many of these squares together as you wanted and build as big a city as you liked. I think in this particular show they were talking about, because it was right after Katrina. I don't remember exactly when that was, but that's a good while ago. It was being proposed as an alternative for cities like New Orleans. You could actually, to some extent, sail this thing or transport this thing. If you saw a terrible weather system moving in, you could maybe tow it away or somehow move it out of harm's way. And it would just be an answer for all kinds of coastal cities that are constantly having flooding problems and catastrophic multi-million dollar disasters. Now, I am just at this point going to add a few things off the top of my head. Um, I thought that was such a cool idea all those years ago. I've been thinking about it in the back of my mind for some time. And for instance, why couldn't you have a submerged city which would somewhat ballast the above surface city? You could still have the kind of free rolling blocks in the middle, but it seems to me that having something beneath the surface would also stabilize the structure. I'm not an engineer, but it seems like you could maybe build a little higher on top. And because, of course, the temperature below would be cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter, you could have the population up there. I don't know why we don't do this in our land bound cities more, but you could have them, uh, depending on the weather, sort of migrate under the surface, um, so that you wouldn't have to spend tons of energy and money on air conditioning. You could go to where it's cool or where it's warm. Uh, if there is a storm and if you can't get the city entirely out of the way, then maybe you would be actually be safer under the water. And it would just be such a very economical use of space. Of course, water for drinking, you'd be able, since it's at sea level always raining, you'd be able to uh, have water collection all over the surface, and that probably wouldn't supply all of your drinking water, but you could have desalination facilities. So there's another one of your essential needs supplied technologically. This is something that we have to worry about all the time. And we worry on in our land-bound cities about whether it's clean enough to drink. It would be relatively clean, I'm assuming. Uh, you could have what I call trailer islands to supply the city with food. These could be agricultural. You could even collect all of those old, um, those plastic things that hold the six packs and the empty milk jugs and all the plastic that's washing around our poor oceans. You could collect that and use it to be the floating nucleus of an island. You could build a whole bunch of these islands, and uh, maybe at first you just grow stuff like algae, but algae is very edible. Some of it's extremely healthy. Maybe below the surface, you could draw fish in to graze them, and that could become part of your diet, of course. If the islands were somewhat more developed, you could grow even trees. You know, you could grow all kinds of vegetation on them. So what I'm saying is, this could be uh, kind of like a biosphere. This could practically be like one of these things that are on the drawing board for interplanetary travel. This would be a completely independent space that could drift around the oceans. And uh, I wrote down here what I called political advantages. Just think of some of the things that could go on in this floating city that would make it a really cool place to live. People, since we seem to be so concerned about intruding into each other's lives and determining who can or can't get married, or who gets to be called by which pronoun or whatever. You could have your own set of rules in this floating city and a whole different set of rules in another floating city. They could be crucibles of social political experimentation. And if you don't like the way things are done on this island, you could go to another. Of course, all of the islands could be independent commonwealths. I don't know exactly how that plays out in terms of international law, but at some point they would leave the jurisdiction of the land-bound country that would claim those coastal waters. So that would be kind of cool, just to be able to make up your own way that you wish to live and then live it out. And other people around the world could see how that works or how that doesn't work. I think that would be quite helpful. I mean, the idea behind states in the United States was supposed to be that we were doing this on land, but apparently we've discarded that. It would be very difficult to invade these places and take them over. Now, probably wouldn't be so difficult for a superpower just to smoke them or nuke them or something or sink them. But why would you do that? The only reason a hostile power would be interested in these floating cities would be because they're wealthy, they're productive. And so why would you destroy one if you're interested in it? It seems like you would more likely want to negotiate with it and maybe strike some kind of commercial deal with it. So this could possibly be a way to spread world peace if people could escape to these independent little floating republics. Then the more despotic, autocratic, land-bound nations might have to kind of change their tune. They might sort of have to loosen up, and if they want to reap the harvest of wealth that's going on these islands, they would have to be more liberal, more tolerant. It's possible. As I say, I don't know why you would invade or destroy an island. What good would it do you, unless you were interested in exploiting its commercial profitability, in which case you would have to leave it in functional shape. Um, this is a short one, and I'm going to wrap it up by saying this. See, the reason I wanted to do a little video on this is I want to leave you with a question. So why don't we do things like this? This, as I say, has been on the drawing board for over a decade. Well, we're not hearing anything about it. Why? We're hearing a whole lot of stuff about how we're all going to be looking out into the street in 10 years and there'll be fish there. We'll all drown. Uh, we're supposed to believe that CO2 is the driver behind all this, even though uh, the in each hemisphere, the time of year when CO2 is most abundant happens to be the coldest time of year. And oh, by the way, plants love CO2. And uh, but you're not supposed to question climate change. You need to shut up, or else you should be sent to prison or maybe shot. You see, what? This is my question. Why are we treating each other this way? Why are we shutting down discussion when, if you really are concerned about the possibility that the climate may be doing some funky things, or that there's just, who could argue that there's just plain too much pollution? Okay, so why do we have to move in lockstep? And there's only one diagnosis and there's only one treatment, and anyone who has any discussion of this should be thrown into jail and have the key turned on him. I've already had this discussion in a previous video, but I'm giving you here an example of something real world, real life. It's like a earthbound space station, a biosphere on our oceans, where we could actually do some good and actually discover some things. And if the ocean level were going up, how much sense would it make to be putting cities on the ocean? It would be, I've talked about ways that you could conserve energy. It would be so ecologically friendly. Why don't we do things like this? Why do we have to pick up sides and be fighting each other tooth and nail to the death? Don't you think maybe it's because some of the people who are trying to program your mind don't want you to think? They're not really concerned about creativity and options and understanding things more deeply. They want to use you. They want to lead you by the nose and use you for their own power lustful ends.